The objective of this lesson is to relate the principle of fraction equivalence to the effect of multiplying by 1. In previous lessons, students have learned how to multiply fractions less than 1. Students used a variety of models to prove their thinking. They also found that the multiplication of two fractions is solved by simply multiplying across the numerators and denominators to obtain the product. Today, they will extend their knowledge to multiplying by fractions equal to 1. Students will also create word problems to represent a given equation. Let's begin with the first problem. This equation can be read as 2/2 of 1/3 equals question mark. The 1/3 is the starting amount, and the 2/2 is the amount being taken. An example of a word problem to match this equation would be, James has 1/3 of his soda can left to drink. His mom says he can drink 2/2 of the leftover amount for lunch. How much of the soda can James drink for lunch? The factor to model first would be the 1/3 of a soda can he had to start with. Draw a rectangle and divide it into thirds. Shade in one of the thirds red to represent the starting amount. The next factor represented in the model is 2/2. Subdivide the rectangle into halves horizontally. Shade in two of the new halves to show the 2/2 that James can drink for lunch. The overlapping section represents the amount of soda James can drink for lunch. There are 2 sections out of 6 sections shaded with both red and green. 2/2 of 1/3 equals 2/6 of the soda can. Notice that the initial starting amount of 1/3 is the same ending amount as 2/6. They are equivalent. It can also be stated that 2/2 of 1/3 is equal to 1/3. This is because even though the starting amount was partitioned, all the partitions were used. Let's look back at the first factor of 2/2. 2/2 is equivalent to 1 whole, or 1. Students have learned about the identity property of multiplication. The identity property of multiplication states that any number multiplied by 1 is that same number. So it makes sense that the fraction of 1/3 multiplied by 2/2, or 1, would equal itself, 1/3. Let's solve this problem numerically. 2/2 of, or multiplied by, 1/3 equals what? Start by multiplying across the numerators. 2 times 1 equals 2. Then the denominators. 2 times 3 equals 6. James can drink 2/6 of his soda can for lunch. Let's solve a similar problem, only using a different fractional form for 1. Let's solve 4/4 of 1/3 equals what? Let's use the same word problem, only this time the first factor will be 4/4. James has 1/3 of his soda can left to drink. His mom says he can drink 4/4 of the leftover amount for lunch. How much of the soda can James drink for lunch? This time, let's solve the problem numerically. Multiply across the numerators. 4 times 1 equals 4. Multiply across the denominators. 4 times 3 is 12. James can have 4/12 of his soda can for lunch. 4/12 is equivalent to 2/6 and 1/3. All the products are equivalent. This is because 1/3 was multiplied by an equivalent fraction to 1. The objective for this lesson was to relate the principle of fraction equivalence to the effect of multiplying by 1. We met this objective by creating real-world problems to represent a fraction multiplication equation where one of the factors was a fraction equal to 1. We modeled the problem with an area model. We found that when one of the factors is a fraction equivalent to 1, the product will be the other factor or a fraction equivalent to the other factor.